I knew something was off the moment I walked into the restaurant. It wasn't anything obvious. The table was beautifully set, the lighting soft and golden, and my son Daniel stood up to greet me with a quick hug. My daughter-in-law, Claire, smiled brightly, too brightly, and gestured toward the seat at the end of the table. My seat, I asked lightly. Best view in the house, she replied. I should have known then. Still, I ignored the feeling. I always ignored it. It had become second nature over the years, to smooth things over, to make excuses, to tell myself I was being too sensitive. It was Mother's Day after all. The waiter brought menus and conversation flowed easily at first. Daniel talked about work, Claire about some renovation plans, and my two grandchildren sat glued to their phones, barely looking up. I tried to join in, offering small comments, asking questions. But my words seemed to dissolve before they landed. Then came the toast. Claire stood, lifting her glass with a polished smile. I just want to say, she began, how lucky we are to have strong women in our lives. Women who know when it's time to step back and let the next generation take over. There was a pause, a few chuckles. She glanced at me. And to Mia, she added, her tone playful, who deserves a long, relaxing break. Maybe somewhere quiet like one of those lovely retirement communities with spa services and early dinners. The table erupted in laughter. Even Daniel laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. I felt it then, that quiet crack inside me. Not dramatic, not visible. Just something shifting, like a foundation giving way beneath a house that had stood too long on unstable ground. I smiled. Of course I did. Well, I said, raising my glass, I suppose peace and quiet wouldn't be the worst thing. More laughter. The moment passed, but something in me didn't. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Claire ordered dessert for everyone. Daniel checked his phone between bites. The kids argued over something trivial, and I sat there, nodding, smiling, responding on cue. Invisible. I thought back to the morning, how I had spent hours getting ready. Not just dressing nicely, but preparing a small gift for Claire. A handmade photo album filled with pictures of the children from when they were younger. She had glanced at it briefly. Oh, that's sweet, she said, before setting it aside. That was it. I had told myself it didn't matter. But sitting there now, I realized something uncomfortable. It did matter. After dinner, Daniel insisted on paying. Claire hugged me lightly, already distracted, talking about meeting her own mother later that evening. We're doing a proper celebration tomorrow, she said. I nodded. Of course they were. I walked home alone. The night air was cool, and the city felt unusually quiet. Or maybe it was just me. Everything inside me had gone still. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just stood there in the dark. For years, I had built my life around them. Every decision, every sacrifice, every adjustment. When Daniel's father died, I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I gave up promotions that would have required relocation. I stayed close, always available, always dependable. And when Daniel married Claire, I tried. God, I tried. I overlooked the small comments, the subtle exclusions, the way plans changed without me being told, the way I was always the last to know, the last to be included if at all. It's just her personality, Daniel would say. She doesn't mean anything by it. Maybe not. But meaning didn't change the result. I turned on the kitchen light and looked around. My apartment was tidy, quiet, predictable. Every object exactly where it belonged. It suddenly felt small. Not physically, emotionally. Like I had been shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I was barely tolerated. I walked to the bookshelf and picked up an old travel guide. I had bought it years ago. Italy. I had always wanted to go.
but there had always been a reason not to.
Daniel needed help with the kids. Money was tight. It wasn't the right time.
There was always something.
I sat down and flipped through the pages. Florence, Venice, the Amalfi Coast. Places that had existed only in imagination.
Until now.
My phone buzzed. Daniel. I stared at the screen. For a moment, I almost answered. Almost slipped back into the familiar rhythm.
Thor?
Yes, of course. No problem at all. Instead, I let it ring, then go silent. A strange calm settled over me. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just clarity. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not out of habit. Out of purpose. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. People rushing to work. The cars filling the streets. Life moving forward. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could choose my direction. Not react.
Choose.
I opened my laptop. The travel guide lay beside me. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then I typed. Long-term European travel packages. The results flooded the screen. Options.
Routes.
Prices. Possibilities. It felt unreal. Like I was stepping into someone else's life. A life where I wasn't just mom or grandma or help when needed. A life where I was simply
Mia.
I spent hours researching, reading reviews, comparing itineraries, looking at photos. 6 weeks, 8 weeks.
Then I saw it.
3 months, multiple countries, flexible schedule, extended stays in smaller towns, not just tourist hotspots. It wasn't cheap, not at all, but I had savings. Savings I had been protecting. For what? For whom? I stared at the booking page. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with something sharper. Freedom. I enter my details slowly,
Carefully.
as if each keystroke mattered, because it did. When I reached the final step, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I knew what it meant. This wasn't just a trip. It was a line, a boundary, a declaration. I pressed confirm. The confirmation email arrived instantly. 3 months. Departure in 12 days. I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. Not the polite smile I had worn at dinner. Not the practiced expression of someone keeping peace. A real smile. Quiet.
Certain. Mine.
That afternoon, Daniel called again. I didn't answer. Not yet. There would be time for explanations later. Or maybe there wouldn't. Either way, for once, that wouldn't be my problem. The 12 days before my departure didn't feel real at first. It was as if I had stepped slightly outside my own life, watching everything unfold from a distance while moving through it with calm precision. I still made my morning coffee, still watered the plants, still nodded politely to the neighbor in the hallway. But underneath it all, something had shifted permanently. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was preparing. I didn't tell anyone. That decision came easily, almost instinctively. Not out of spite, not even out of anger, but because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. There would be questions, concerns disguised as criticism, subtle guilt, and ultimately pressure to reconsider. 3 months is too long. What about the kids? Why didn't you discuss this with us first? I could already hear Claire's voice, calm but sharp, slicing my decision into something selfish. And Daniel, he would hesitate, unsure which side to stand on, defaulting as always to the easiest path, the one that required the least disruption. So I chose silence. Not dramatic silence, not cold withdrawal, just absence of explanation. Instead, I made lists, practical ones at first, bills to schedule, documents to gather,
Clothes to pack.
then less practical ones, books I wanted to read, cities I wanted to walk through without a destination. Things I might discover about myself if I stopped being useful to everyone else. The bank visit felt strangely significant. The young clerk smiled politely as I requested access to my savings, though I noticed the flicker of curiosity in her eyes when I mentioned travel.
That sounds amazing, she said.
3 months in Europe? I nodded, almost amused by how easily the words came out now. 3 months. It no longer felt like an impossible fantasy. It felt appropriate, necessary even. I withdrew what I needed and left the rest untouched, not out of fear, but out of a quiet confidence that I would manage. I always had. At home, I began sorting through my belongings, not because I planned to leave permanently, but because I suddenly saw everything differently. Drawers filled with things I kept just in case. Clothes I hadn't worn in years, but couldn't justify discarding. Objects tied to memories that no longer felt warm, just heavy. I wasn't running away from my life, but I was no longer willing to carry all of it with me. On the 4th day, Daniel called again. This time, I answered. Mia, hey, he said, relief in his voice. I tried calling yesterday. I know, I replied calmly. There was a brief pause. Everything okay?
Yes.
Just busy. With what? He asked, not suspicious, just curious in that distant, surface-level way he had developed over the years. Just things I've been putting off, I said. He accepted that answer immediately. Of course he did. Listen, he continued. Claire wanted to know if you're free this weekend. We've got a dinner thing, and we thought maybe you could watch the kids. There it was. The familiar expectation. The unspoken assumption that my time was always available, always flexible, always theirs to request without hesitation. I can't, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Oh, okay. Everything all right? Yes, I repeated, steady and unbothered. I just have plans. He didn't ask what plans. He didn't push. All right, he said finally. Maybe next time. Maybe, I replied. We hung up. I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, and realized something subtle but powerful. For the first time, I hadn't explained myself. I hadn't softened the refusal with apologies or justifications. I had simply declined. And the world hadn't ended. The next few days unfolded with the same quiet rhythm. I arranged for my mail to be held, asked a neighbor to keep an eye on the apartment, and created a small folder with emergency contacts, just in case. Not because I expected anything to go wrong, but because I had spent a lifetime preparing for contingencies. Some habits don't disappear overnight. On the 7th day, I took out an old suitcase from the closet. It had been years since I last used it. I placed it on the bed and opened it slowly, the faint scent of fabric and time escaping into the room. Packing felt different than I expected. Not frantic, not overwhelming. Deliberate. I chose each item carefully. Comfortable clothes, a few nicer pieces, sensible shoes, a lightweight jacket. Then I paused, looking at the limited space, and understood something important. I didn't need much. Not to live. Not to feel like myself. I added a small notebook, a pen, and after a moment's hesitation, the old travel guide. It felt symbolic now, no longer a reminder of postponed dreams, but proof that they hadn't disappeared completely. On the 9th day, Claire called. That, more than anything, surprised me. Mia, she said, her voice smooth as ever. We haven't seen you since Mother's Day. Just wanted to check in. It sounded polite.
Concerned, even.
But I had learned to hear what wasn't being said. I've been busy, I replied. With what? She asked, the question sharper than Daniel's had been. Personal things. Another pause. Well, she said lightly, we're having people over next week. It would be nice if you could come. and maybe help a bit beforehand. You're so good at organizing these things. Of course. Not we'd love to see you. Not how are you feeling, but usefulness. Contribution. Function. I won't be available, I said. This time, the silence on the other end was unmistakable. Is everything okay? She asked, but now there was an edge beneath the words. Yes. You seem different. I almost smiled. I am, I said simply. She didn't know what to do with that. Well, she replied after a moment, let me know if you change your mind. I won't, I said gently. We ended the call. And just like that, another invisible thread loosened. By the 10th day, the apartment felt lighter, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because I had. I moved through the rooms with a sense of closure, not loss. I cleaned thoroughly, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to leave things in order. Not for them, for me. On the 11th night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from anticipation. I walked through the apartment slowly, touching familiar surfaces. The back of the chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the window frame where I had stood so many mornings watching the world go by. This place had held my life for years. My routines, my quiet sacrifices, my unnoticed presence. It deserved acknowledgement, but it no longer defined me. The next morning arrived clear and bright. My suitcase stood by the door. Everything was ready. Almost. I sat down at the small table in the kitchen and took out a piece of paper. I didn't want to leave without a word, but I also refused to explain myself away. So I wrote, I'm traveling for a while. I'm safe.
Don't worry about me.
I'll reach out when I'm ready.
Mia.
No details.
No apology. No timeline.
I placed the note on the table, weighed down with a small ceramic cup Daniel had made as a child. For a moment, I traced its uneven rim with my finger. Then I stood up. At exactly 9:15, I closed the door behind me, locked it, and walked away. I didn't look back. Not because I was trying to be strong, but because I didn't need to anymore. The first 3 days felt like stepping into someone else's life. Everything was unfamiliar, yet strangely effortless. The airport, the long flight, the quiet hum of a different language surrounding me, it all blurred together into a kind of soft transition, like my old life had slowly faded out instead of ending abruptly. When I finally arrived in Florence, dragging my suitcase over uneven stone streets, I expected to feel overwhelmed. Instead, I felt light, not happy, not yet, but lighter. My small rented apartment overlooked a narrow street lined with faded ochre buildings and tiny balconies overflowing with plants. It wasn't luxurious, not even particularly modern, but it had something my old place didn't anymore. It felt like possibility. I set my suitcase down in the middle of the room and just stood there listening. No phone ringing. No background noise of television or obligation. Just distant footsteps, a passing scooter, voices echoing somewhere below. For the first time in years, there was no one expecting anything from me, and I didn't know what to do with that. The first day, I barely left the apartment. I told myself it was jet lag, and maybe part of it was, but mostly it was something deeper. A kind of emotional exhaustion I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I slept, woke up, wandered from room to room, sat by the window, then lay down again. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like my body and mind were finally catching up after years of constant motion. On the second day, I forced myself outside. Not with a plan, not with a list of places to see, just outside. The streets of Florence unfolded around me like a painting I had somehow stepped into. Warm stone, narrow alleys, sunlight catching on old windows, the smell of coffee drifting from small cafes tucked into corners. People moved differently here, slower, more present, less hurried. I walked without direction, turning wherever something caught my attention, letting myself get slightly lost. And no one noticed me. At first, that stung. Back home, being unnoticed had felt like rejection, like erasure. Here it felt different. Here it felt like freedom. No one knew me as mom. No one saw me as available. No one expected me to step in, fix things, smooth things over. I was just another person walking down a street in a city full of strangers. Just Mia. I stopped at a small cafe and sat outside, ordering coffee and hesitant, in perfect Italian. The waiter smiled kindly, correcting my pronunciation without making me feel foolish. I sat there longer than necessary, watching people pass by, noticing details I would have ignored before, the way an elderly couple walked hand in hand, the way a young woman laughed openly with her friend, the way no one seemed in a rush to be somewhere else. Time felt different here, not measured by usefulness, but by experience. That realization settled somewhere deep inside me, quiet but steady. On the third day, the guilt arrived. It came suddenly, without warning, as I stood in a small art shop near the river, running my fingers over handmade postcards. One moment I was admiring the colors, the next I felt it, sharp, intrusive, undeniable. What are you doing here? The thought hit hard. What kind of mother leaves without telling anyone where she's going? What kind of grandmother disappears for months? I stepped outside, the air suddenly feeling heavier, and leaned against the cool stone wall. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the familiar weight of responsibility pressing back in. For years, that voice had guided every decision I made. It had kept me dependable, reliable, selfless. It had also kept me small. I reached for my phone almost automatically. Daniel's name sat there, one tap away. I imagined his voice. Confused. Maybe worried. Maybe even hurt. I imagined Claire, what she would say, how she would frame my absence as something unreasonable, something selfish. My finger hovered. Then I remembered the toast. Not just the words, but the laughter. The ease with which I had been turned into a joke. The way no one had paused to consider how it might feel. The guilt didn't disappear, but it shifted. It was no longer a command, just a feeling. I put the phone back in my bag
and walked on.
That evening, back in the apartment, I sat by the window with a small glass of wine and tried to make sense of everything I was feeling. Freedom and guilt existed side by side, neither canceling the other out. I realized then that healing wasn't going to be simple or immediate. It wasn't a clean break from the past. It was a process, a slow untangling of habits, expectations, and beliefs I had carried for decades. And I had only just begun. The days that followed started to form a rhythm. Mornings were quiet. Coffee by the window, sometimes a short walk before the streets filled with people. Afternoons were for wandering, museums, markets, hidden corners of the city that felt like discoveries even when they weren't. Evenings were slower, often spent writing in the notebook I had brought with me. At first, I didn't know what to write. Then one day, the words came. Not polished, not structured, just honest. I wrote about the years after Daniel's father died, about the exhaustion I had never admitted, about the choices I made without ever questioning whether I had another option. I wrote about Claire, about the subtle ways she had pushed me to the edges, about the things I had ignored because it felt easier than confronting them. I wrote about Daniel, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet sadness. He hadn't meant to hurt me, but he had allowed it. And I had allowed it too. That realization was harder to accept than anything else. I had spent so long being needed that I had forgotten to ask whether I was valued. And there is a difference. One afternoon, about a week into my stay, I wandered into a small gallery tucked away on a side street. It wasn't crowded, just a few visitors moving quietly between paintings. I almost turned around, unsure if I belonged there, but something made me stay. The paintings were unlike anything I had expected. Not perfect, not precise, but expressive. Bold colors, imperfect lines, emotion captured in a way that felt raw and unfiltered. I stood in front of one piece for a long time, a stormy landscape, chaotic and beautiful at the same time. It didn't look controlled. It looked felt, and something inside me responded. I didn't have the words for it yet, but I knew I was seeing something I had been missing. Not just in art, in myself. That night, back at the apartment, I opened my notebook again. But instead of writing about the past, I wrote something different. A question. Who am I when no one needs me?
I stared at it for a long time.
Then, slowly, I added another line. And who could I become? For the first time, the question didn't scare me.
It intrigued me.
Outside, the city moved as it always did. Voices, footsteps, distant laughter echoing through the narrow streets. Life continued, indifferent to my small personal transformation. And yet, everything had changed. Not around me, within me. The weight I had been carrying for years, the expectations, the roles, the quiet obligations I had never questioned, had begun to lift. Not completely, but enough for me to notice the difference. Enough for me to breathe. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a life that, slowly but surely, was starting to feel like my own. By the time the second week began, Florence no longer felt like a place I was visiting. It felt like somewhere I had quietly stepped into, as if a version of my life had been waiting here all along, paused, patient, until I finally arrived. I had stopped checking maps constantly, stopped worrying about where I should go. Instead, I followed instincts, turning down streets because they looked interesting, sitting in cafes simply because the chairs caught the sunlight in a certain way. And in that quiet shift, something unexpected happened. I started to notice myself. Not in the surface way, appearance, posture, the things people usually see, but internally. My reactions, my thoughts. The space between impulse and action that I had never really examined before. Back home, everything had been automatic. Someone asked, I agreed. Someone needed, I adjusted. Here, there was no script. And without that script, I began to see how much of my life had been lived on reflex rather than choice. It was on a warm afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after my arrival, that something changed again. I had returned to the small gallery I'd stumbled into days earlier. I told myself it was curiosity, but deep down I knew it was something else. That painting, the stormy one, had stayed with me, not as an image, but as a feeling I couldn't quite name. The gallery was quiet, just as before, but this time I didn't linger near the entrance. I walked in with a strange sense of familiarity, as if I belonged there just as much as anyone else. I moved slowly from piece to piece, noticing things I hadn't before. The texture of brushstrokes, the layering of colors, the imperfections that made each work feel alive rather than polished. You see differently now. The voice startled me. I turned to find an older woman standing a few steps away, watching me with a calm, knowing expression. Her hair was silver, cut short, and her clothes were simple but deliberate. Nothing accidental about her presence.
I'm sorry,
I said. You're not looking at the paintings the way tourists do, she continued. You're not trying to understand them. You're feeling them. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I didn't realize there was a difference. She smiled slightly. Most people don't. There was something about her, direct but not intrusive, observant without being judgmental. It reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place, or maybe someone I used to be before life became so structured. I've seen you here before, she added. You stood in front of that one for a long time. She gestured toward the stormy painting. I couldn't explain why, I admitted. You don't need to explain it, she said simply. That's the point. We stood there in silence for a moment, both looking at the painting. It feels, I began, then stopped. Unfinished, she suggested. I shook my head.
No.
Honest. That made her smile. My name is Elena, she said, extending her hand.
Mia.
Well, Mia, she said, have you ever painted? The question caught me off guard. No, I replied quickly. Not really. Not really, she repeated, which usually means yes, but not seriously. I let out a small laugh. Maybe when I was younger. Nothing important. Nothing important, she echoed again, as if testing the weight of the words. Then she tilted her head slightly. Would you like to try? I blinked.
Now.
She nodded toward a small room at the back of the gallery. I hold informal sessions there. Not classes. Just space. Paint, canvas, no expectations. Every instinct I had built over years told me to decline politely. To say it wasn't my thing, that I wasn't prepared, that I didn't want to waste her time. But another voice, quieter, newer, asked a different question.
Why not?
I wouldn't know where to start, I said honestly.
Elena Shrubjed.
That's usually the best place. The room was simple. A few easels, jars of brushes, tubes of paint scattered across a long wooden table. It didn't feel intimidating. It didn't feel formal. It felt open. Elena handed me a blank canvas.
Don't think, she said.
Just begin. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space in front of me. It felt oddly familiar, like the question I had written in my notebook. Who am I when no one needs me? My hand hovered over the brushes. Then, slowly, I picked one up. The first stroke felt wrong. The second felt uncertain. By the third, something shifted. I wasn't trying to create something recognizable. I wasn't aiming for beauty or accuracy. I was simply moving. Color onto canvas. Emotion without translation. Time disappeared. I don't know how long I stood there painting. Minutes, maybe hours. When I finally stepped back, I was surprised, not by what I had created, but by how I felt.
Clear.
Lighter. As if something inside me had been given a voice without needing words. Elena studied the canvas quietly. You see, she said after a moment. I looked at her. It's not good. She shook her head. That's not the question. I frowned slightly. Then what is? How does it feel? I turned back to the painting. It feels like me, I said slowly. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a small answer. After that day, everything began to shift again. I returned to the gallery regularly. Not every day, not on a strict schedule, but often enough that it became part of my rhythm. Each time, I painted a little more freely, a little less concerned with whether it made sense.
Elena rarely instructed, rarely corrected.
She observed, occasionally asked questions, but mostly she allowed space. And in that space, I began to understand something I hadn't before. For years, I had defined myself through what I provided: support, care, stability. I had measured my worth by how useful I was to others. But standing in that small room, paint on my hands, completely absorbed in something that had no external purpose, I realized there was another way to exist. Not as a function, but as a person. The guilt still visited sometimes, usually at night. I would sit by the window, phone in hand, scrolling through missed messages from Daniel. They had shifted in tone, less casual, more persistent. Are you okay? Just let me know you're safe. Mom, please. I read every one. And still, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, but because I was finally starting to understand something important. Caring didn't mean abandoning myself. I needed more time. Time to become someone who could return, not as the person they expected, but as the person I was discovering. One evening, after another long session at the gallery, I walked back through the quiet streets, the sky fading into soft shades of blue and gold. I caught my reflection in a shop window and paused. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I carried myself differently. Straighter,
calmer, present.
I studied that reflection for a few seconds longer. Then, without thinking, I smiled. Not for anyone else. Just for me. And in that small, simple moment, I realized something profound. I was meeting a version of myself I had never known. And I wasn't sure I ever wanted to go back. By the time the third month began, my days no longer felt like an escape. They felt like a life, one I had built quietly, piece by piece, without asking permission, without adjusting myself to fit anyone else's expectations. Florence had become familiar in a way that surprised me. I had favorite streets now, favorite cafes where the staff greeted me with a nod of recognition, favorite times of day when the light hit the buildings just right and made everything look almost unreal. I had a rhythm, and more importantly, I had a sense of self within that rhythm. Painting had become more than something I tried. It was something I needed. Not in a desperate way, but in the same way you need air when you finally realize you've been breathing too shallowly for years. I spent hours in the small studio at the back of the gallery, losing track of time, letting color and movement express things I still couldn't fully articulate. Elena never praised me excessively, never criticized harshly. She simply observed, occasionally offering a quiet "keep going" or "don't stop there," as if she understood that what mattered wasn't the result. It was the process of allowing myself to exist without restriction. One afternoon, she stood beside me as I worked on a piece that felt different from the others. It wasn't chaotic like my earlier attempts. It was more structured, but still emotional, like something inside me had begun to settle without losing its intensity. "You're not painting to release anymore," she said. I paused, brush in hand. "What do you mean?" "At the beginning, everything was coming out all at once," she explained. "Now you're choosing what to say." I looked at the canvas again. She was right, and that realization felt significant, because it meant I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was becoming deliberate. That evening, I returned to my apartment with paint still faintly marking my fingers, a quiet satisfaction settling into my chest. For once, I didn't feel the urge to analyze everything, to question whether I was doing the right thing. I simply existed in the moment, letting the calm stay where it was. Until my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. By now, I had grown used to the messages. Daniel's name appearing on the screen had become part of the background of my days, something present, but not urgent. But something made me pick it up this time. The message was different. "Mom, I know you don't want to talk. I understand that now, but I need you to know something. I'm not asking you to come back. I just want to say I'm sorry. Not in the way I used to say it. I see things differently now. Please just read this." Below, it was a long message, longer than anything he had ever sent before. I sat down slowly, my heart suddenly unsteady in a way I hadn't felt in weeks, and began to read. He wrote about the house, about how everything had started to fall apart after I left. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, in ways he hadn't noticed before. The routines I had quietly maintained, the small things I had handled without acknowledgement, the constant presence that had held everything together without ever being seen. He wrote about the children, how they missed me, not just for what I did, but for how I made things feel. How the house had become louder, more chaotic, more tense. How Emma had asked one night why no one laughed the way they used to when I was around. That line stayed with me. He wrote about Claire, not with anger, but with clarity. How he had started noticing things he used to ignore. The comments, the tone, the way she dismissed me, the way he had allowed it because it was easier than confronting it. He admitted he had chosen comfort over truth. That he had failed not just me, but himself and his children. And then he wrote something that made my breath catch. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve that. But I'm trying to understand who you are outside of being my mother. And I realize now, I never really asked. I never really saw you.
I want to change that.
Not because I want things to go back to how they were, but because I don't want to lose you completely. I stared at the screen for a long time after I finished reading. The room felt different. Not smaller, but heavier. Not with guilt, with significance. This wasn't the same Daniel who had laughed at the table. This was someone who had been forced to see what he had avoided for years. And yet, I didn't feel immediate relief. I didn't feel the urge to call him, to fix things, to reassure him. What I felt was careful, measured, because for the first time, I understood that my response mattered, not just to him, but to me. I stood up and walked to the window, the familiar street below glowing softly under the evening lights. People moved through their lives, unaware of the shift happening in mine. And I realized something important. I wasn't the same person who had left. And that meant I couldn't respond the same way either. I picked up my notebook instead of my phone. For a while, I just stared at the blank page. Then I began to write. Not a message to send.
Just thoughts. What do I want now?
The question felt different than it had before. Before, it had been abstract. Now, it was real. Did I want to rebuild the relationship?
Yes.
But not at the cost of losing myself again. Did I want to see Daniel?
Yes.
But not as the version of me he expected, as who I was becoming. That distinction mattered more than anything. I sat there for a long time, letting the thoughts settle, letting the emotions move without rushing to resolve them. For years, I had responded quickly, fixing, smoothing, adjusting. Now I allowed space. And in that space, clarity formed. I would answer him, but not tonight. Not from emotion. From intention. The next morning, I returned to the gallery. Elena noticed immediately that something was different. You're quieter, she said. I heard from my son, I replied. She nodded, as if that explained everything. And she asked, and I don't know what to do yet. She smiled slightly. Then don't do anything yet. I frowned. It feels like I should respond. Should, she repeated. Or want. I didn't answer, because I understood the difference now. Later, as I stood in front of a new canvas, brush in hand, I realized something unexpected. For the first time, I wasn't painting to process pain. I was painting from a place of strength. The strokes were steadier, the choices more deliberate, not forced, not reactive,
just mine.
That evening, I finally picked up my phone. I opened Daniel's message again, reading it once more, not searching for flaws, not analyzing every word, but simply understanding it. Then I began to type. I didn't rush. I didn't over-explain. I didn't apologize for taking time. I'm safe. I've been taking time to understand myself in ways I never allowed before. I read your message. I believe you're trying to see things clearly, and that matters. I'm not ready to come back to the life I left, but I'm open to talking when I am, not as things were, but as something new. I hope you understand. I read it twice, then sent it. No dramatic emotion followed. No immediate sense of closure. Just calm. A different kind of calm than before. One that didn't come from distance, but from balance. I set the phone down and returned to the window, watching the city settle into night once again. For the first time, the connection between my old life and my new one didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something that could exist, carefully, intentionally on my terms. And that changed everything. 3 months earlier, I had walked out of my apartment with a suitcase and a quiet resolve, not fully understanding where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay the same. Now, standing in the soft morning light of a different country, a different life, I finally understood something I hadn't been able to name before. I hadn't left to escape. I had left to return. Not to a place. To myself. The final weeks of my journey didn't feel rushed or uncertain. They felt intentional. Florence had given me space to breathe, to unravel years of quiet compromise, to face truths I had avoided. But something inside me had begun to shift again, not away from that life, but forward from it. I no longer felt like I was hiding from anything. I felt like I was ready to build something. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare me.
It excited me.
My days were still filled with painting, with long walks, with moments of stillness I had once been afraid of. But now those moments didn't feel empty. They felt full of awareness, of choice, of presence. I no longer reached for distractions or obligations to fill the silence. I allowed it to exist, and in doing so, I realized it wasn't silence at all. It was clarity. Elena noticed it before I said anything. "You're leaving soon," she said one afternoon as I cleaned my brushes. It wasn't a question. I looked at her, surprised. "How did you know?" She smiled faintly. "You're not searching anymore." That simple observation settled something inside me. She was right. I wasn't searching. I had found something. Not all the answers. Not a perfect plan. But a foundation. A sense of self that didn't depend on anyone else's expectations. "I don't know exactly where I'm going next," I admitted. "But I know I'm not going back to what I was."
Elena nodded.
That's enough. We stood there in comfortable silence, surrounded by canvases that marked my transformation more honestly than words ever could. Each one carried a piece of me, not the version I had been forced to be, but the version I had uncovered. Before I left, she handed me one of the smaller canvases I had painted during my first week.
"Take it," she said.
I hesitated. "It's not very good." She gave me a look I had come to recognize. "It's not supposed to be," she replied. "It's where you began." I took it carefully, understanding what she meant. It wasn't about the painting. It was about remembering. The morning I left Florence, I didn't feel the heaviness I had expected. No sense of loss, no fear of what came next. Just a quiet gratitude. This city had given me something I hadn't known I needed. Not escape, not distraction, but space. Space to see clearly. Space to choose differently. As the train carried me away, I watched the landscape shift slowly, the familiar giving way to the unknown once again. But this time, it didn't feel like stepping into uncertainty. It felt like continuing something I had already begun. I didn't go home. Not immediately. Instead, I chose another city. Smaller. Quieter. Less about discovery, more about living. I rented a modest apartment with large windows and enough space to set up a small corner for painting. It wasn't temporary in the same way Florence had been. It felt grounded. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something that resembled a life. I found a local market where I bought fresh food, a cafe where I sat with my notebook, a quiet routine that belonged entirely to me. There were no expectations attached to it. No one relying on me to hold things together. And yet, everything felt more stable than it had in years. Because this time, I was part of the structure, not just the support. Daniel and I began to speak occasionally. At first, the conversations were careful.
Short.
Respectful. Neither of us pushing too far, too fast. But there was something different in his voice now. Not the distracted tone I had grown used to. Not the automatic responses. Presence. He listened. really listened. And I spoke differently too. I didn't soften everything. I didn't rush to make things comfortable. I said what I meant, even when it felt unfamiliar. It wasn't easy, but it was real. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. "I think I'm starting to understand you," he admitted. "Not as mom, just you." I didn't respond right away, because for years, that was all I had wanted. Not appreciation for what I did, but recognition of who I was. "I'm still figuring that out myself," I said finally. And for once, that didn't feel like uncertainty. It felt like truth. Months passed. Not quickly, but steadily. My life didn't become perfect. It became mine. I painted regularly, sometimes for hours, sometimes just for a few quiet moments. I explored new places without urgency. I learned how to sit with myself without needing to fill every space with purpose or usefulness. And slowly something else returned.
Joy.
Not the loud, performative kind, the quiet kind, the kind that exists in small moments. A cup of coffee in the morning light, a brushstroke that feels right, a conversation that doesn't require you to shrink yourself. Daniel visited once. We met in my new city, not in the past we had left behind. It was different, not emotional in the overwhelming way I had imagined. Calmer, honest. We walked through the streets, talked about things we had never talked about before. Not just the past, but the future. Not expectations, but possibilities. "I don't want things to go back," he said at one point.
Neither do I replied.
And we both understood what that meant. This wasn't about restoring what had been broken. It was about building something new, something that allowed both of us to exist fully, without roles that erased who we were. One evening, months later, I stood by the window of my apartment, the same way I had on that first night before everything changed. The city outside was unfamiliar, but the feeling wasn't. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who sat quietly at the edge of the table, the one who smiled when it hurt, the one who waited to be seen. And I realized something simple, but powerful. She hadn't disappeared. She had grown. She had learned. She had finally stepped forward. I wasn't angry at her. I was grateful, because she had endured long enough for me to become this. I turned away from the window and walked toward the small corner where my paints were laid out. A blank canvas waited, untouched, open. Not intimidating, inviting. I picked up a brush, paused for a moment, and then began. Not to prove anything, not to process pain, but to create. Because I could, because I wanted to, because I had chosen this life.